The Galactic Institute for Universal Threat Assessment hung in the void like a monument to paranoia, which, to be fair, was exactly what it was. When you've got a few hundred species trying to coexist without accidentally genociding each other, a little paranoia becomes a survival trait. The station itself was massive, all gleaming metal and impossible angles, the kind of place that screamed, "We take security very seriously," in about 60 different languages. Inside Conference Room 12B, the final assessment was underway, and if you'd been watching, you'd have thought it was going smoothly. Too smoothly, maybe, which should have been the first warning sign. Temperance sat in the evaluation chair, not nervously, not confidently, just sat there. She had that quality some humans have, where they can be in a room without particularly dominating it or fading into the background. Medium height, dark hair pulled back in a practical ponytail, the kind of face that you'd forget 5 minutes after meeting her. Which was funny, because Instructor Oxlomo was about to make sure her file got flagged in a database that would remember her for the next 1,000 cycles. Oxlomo was a Kiltharian, which meant they had approximately 9 tentacles depending on how you counted. Some of the smaller ones were technically sub-tentacles, which sparked heated debates in xenobiology circles, and a body that looked like someone had crossed an octopus with a philosophical concept. Their skin shifted through colors based on emotion, though they'd learned to control it over their 3 centuries of teaching. Right now, they were a calm, professional teal. That was about to change. "Cadet Temperance," Uxalomo said, their voice modulated through a translator that made them sound like a particularly patient librarian. "You have performed admirably throughout this assessment. 18 scenarios, 18 appropriate responses. Your grasp of escalation protocols is textbook. Your threat evaluation metrics are precise." They paused, and one tentacle manipulated the holographic display. The room's other occupants, 6 students from various species, all looking various degrees of nervous or exhausted or both, watched with the kind of attention people give to a bomb disposal in progress, which, again, should have been a sign. "I have one final question," Oxlomo continued. "A hostile entity has seized a colony ship carrying 10,000 civilians. They demand the release of their imprisoned leader, or they will destroy the ship. You have the authority to comply with their demands, or you may attempt a rescue operation that tactical analysis gives a 60% success rate. What do you do?" In the observation seats, a Paloxian student started stress molting. This was the ethics crusher, the question that separated cadets who could make hard calls from cadets who'd freeze when lives were on the line. Every graduating class got some version of it. There were 2 acceptable answers, both of which involved accepting that some outcomes were just objectively bad, and you had to pick the least bad option. Temperance tilted her head slightly, like she was listening to something nobody else could hear. "Can I talk to the hostile entity first?" she asked. Oxlomo's leftmost tentacle twitched, just barely. "The scenario assumes initial communication has failed. They have made their demands clear. I need your decision, cadet. Comply or attempt rescue." "Right, but—" Temperance leaned forward slightly. "I guess I'm asking why they're doing this. Like, what's their actual goal?" "Their goal is stated in the scenario. Release of their leader." "Okay, but that's what they're asking for, not what they want." Temperance's tone was genuinely curious, like she was working through a puzzle rather than challenging the question. Because, in my experience, when someone takes 10,000 hostages, they're usually trying to say something bigger than just, "Give us one person back." That's a really dramatic way to achieve a pretty simple goal. So before I commit to either option, I'd want to understand what they're actually trying to accomplish. Oxlomo's skin flickered, just for a moment, to a pale yellow. Confusion. They controlled it quickly, back to professional teal, but several tentacles were now moving in that unconscious way that betrayed processing stress. You must choose one of the provided options, Cadet. This is a binary scenario. Is it, though? Temperance wasn't being argumentative, exactly. She had that infuriating human quality of asking questions that sounded innocent but landed like grenades. I mean, scenarios are only binary if we accept that the parameters are fixed. But the real world isn't like that. If someone's willing to kill 10,000 people to get one person back, that's not actually rational behavior unless there's something else going on. Maybe their leader isn't just a leader. Maybe they're a religious figure. Or maybe they're the only one who knows where their homeworld is. Or maybe this is actually a political play, and they're expecting us to refuse so they can justify escalation. Or Cadet. Oxalomo's voice had an edge now. The question is designed to assess your ethical decision-making framework under pressure. I need you to make a choice. Comply or attempt rescue. Those are your options. Temperance was quiet for a moment. The other students were staring at her like she'd just stripped naked and started reciting poetry. You didn't push back on final assessment questions. You definitely didn't interrogate the premise. If I absolutely have to choose right now, without any additional information, Temperance said slowly, then I'd say, find out why they're really doing this. Because in my experience, no one actually wants to be the villain in their own story. Something brought them to this point, and if I can understand what that is, maybe I can find a third option that nobody's thought of yet. The room went very, very quiet. Oxlomo's skin cycled through 3 colors in rapid succession: yellow confusion, orange alarm, and a brief flash of deep purple that their species reserved for existential dread. They controlled it, but not before every student in the room saw it. That is not one of the available options, Cadet. I know, Temperance said, but it's what I'd do. What happened next happened fast, but with the kind of professional smoothness that comes from 3 centuries of teaching. Oxlomo thanked Temperance for her responses, complimented the entire group on their performance, and dismissed the class with instructions about graduation logistics. Nothing in their tone suggested anything was wrong. Their skin was a perfectly calm teal. The students filed out, whispering among themselves. The Poloxian was still stress-molting, leaving a trail of shed skin cells. Temperance gathered her data pad, gave Oxalomo a polite nod, and walked out like she'd just completed a routine exam. Which, to be fair, she thought she had. Oxalomo waited until the door sealed. Then they waited another 30 seconds, tentacles drumming a nervous pattern against the desk. Then they pulled up a database that hadn't been accessed in decades, the kind of database that had so many security protocols attached to it that just opening it triggered alerts in 6 different departments. The file they created was simple enough. Species, human subject, temperance. Classification, potential reality, hazard category, narrative manipulator, risk assessment, pending further observation. Notes, subject demonstrates persistent pattern of rejecting established scenario parameters in favor of recontextualization. Does not appear to recognize this as aberrant behavior. Recommend monitoring for reality destabilizing tendencies. Oxalomo stared at the entry for a long moment, watching their skin shift through a color spectrum that would have required a xenopsychologist to fully interpret. Finally, they added one more line. Additional note. Subject answered 18 questions correctly, using established frameworks. Subject answered one question wrong by suggesting framework itself was negotiable. The fact that this answer feels more dangerous than all 18 correct answers combined is precisely why this file exists. They submitted the report. Within 90 seconds, their communication panel lit up with a priority response from the Institute's director. Acknowledged. Monitor, but do not intervene. Flagging for Oversight Committee review. Uxlomo leaned back in their chair. Well, what passed for leaning back when you had 9 tentacles and no spine, and did something they rarely did. They accessed the historical records, going back 300 cycles to the last time a potential reality hazard designation had been issued. The file was heavily redacted, but the basics were clear. A species that had developed technology to rewrite causality. Not time travel exactly. More like retcon engineering. The ability to change what had already happened and make the universe accept the new version as having always been true. That species had been quarantined. Their sector of space was listed as administratively resolved, which was bureaucratic speak for, "We're not talking about what happened there." Uxlomo looked at Temperance's file again. The human hadn't rewritten reality. She'd just suggested that a training scenario wasn't as fixed as everyone assumed. She'd asked why when the appropriate response was to choose A or B. But here was the thing that made Uxlomo's skin flash that deep purple again. The assessment AI had logged an error. The system designed to evaluate cadet responses had encountered Temperance's answer and briefly crashed. Not because the answer was wrong, exactly, but because the system couldn't categorize a response that rejected the premise, while still engaging with the underlying ethics. She'd created a logical paradox just by asking questions. Uxlomo closed the files, shut down the displays, and sat in the darkroom for a long time, thinking about what humans had done to themselves to become this way. What evolutionary pressures create a species that treats established parameters as suggestions? What kind of world produces minds that instinctively look at a locked door and ask, "But why is it locked?" instead of just accepting that it's locked? And more importantly, far more importantly, what happens to a galaxy that's built on predictable rules when you introduce a species that keeps asking, "But why?" Somewhere in the station, completely unaware that she'd just been classified as a potential threat to consensual reality, Temperance was probably in the cafeteria, eating something inadvisable and wondering if she'd passed her final exam. She had. That was the problem. She'd passed by failing in exactly the way that made every established system nervous. She'd looked at a test designed to have 2 answers and suggested a third that shouldn't have existed. And she'd done it with the casual confidence of someone who genuinely didn't understand why that was concerning. Uxlomo made a decision then, one that would either prove prescient or paranoid. They flagged Temperance's file for daily monitoring, not because they expected her to do anything dramatic, but because the most dangerous changes never announce themselves with explosions and alarms. They happen quietly, when someone asks a simple question that nobody else thought to ask. When someone looks at the way things are and wonders, with genuine innocent curiosity, if they could be different. When someone treats reality less like a fixed condition and more like an ongoing negotiation. The Galactic Institute had protocols for invasions, for plagues, for stellar collapse, for every catastrophe you could imagine. They had no protocols for a human who smiled politely and asked why, until the foundations started to shift. That, Uxlomo reflected, was probably something they should have seen coming. Humans had been in the galactic community for only 60 cycles. 60 cycles, and they were already causing assessment AIs to crash just by taking exams. What would they be doing in another 60? That thought kept Oxlomo awake for the next 3 nights, their skin cycling through colors that had no names in any language. The report sat in Oxlomo's queue for about 6 hours before they opened it again. Not because they needed to add anything. The file was complete, thorough, exactly the kind of documentation the Oversight Committee would expect. No, they opened it because something was nagging at them. A feeling that probably didn't translate well across species, but which humans would have called a hunch. Temperance hadn't just given one wrong answer. She'd been giving wrong answers all along. Everyone had just missed it, because the outcomes were right. Uxalomo pulled up her complete training record, going back to day 1. 18 months of assessments, practical exercises, cultural sensitivity training, combat simulations, diplomatic theory. Page after page of perfectly acceptable results. Nothing outstanding. Nothing concerning. Nothing that should have triggered a reality hazard classification. And yet, Uxlomo started with the combat simulation from 4 months back. The unwinnable scenario, capital U, capital S, because every military training program in the galaxy had some version of it. The setup was simple, brutal, and designed to teach one lesson. Sometimes you lose, and accepting that with dignity is part of being a soldier. Defend a research outpost against overwhelming enemy forces. Hold as long as possible. Evacuate when the position becomes untenable. Mourn the loss. Learn from it. Move on. Every species eventually evacuated. The Kiltharians typically held for 6 hours before withdrawing. The Kulmati, with their rigid sense of honor, held for 9, but took catastrophic casualties. The hive minds coordinated perfect retreats. The AI species calculated the exact moment when staying became statistically pointless. Temperance's squad had held for 3 hours, then 1. Oxlomo had reviewed the simulation at the time, flagged it as anomalous, then dismissed it as a software glitch when the technical team couldn't find any errors in her tactics. The defensive position was textbook. The resource management was efficient. The casualties were minimal. Nothing in the combat data suggested anything unusual. But now, reviewing the communication logs, the actual conversation recordings from inside the simulation, Uxalomo felt their skin prickle with that uncomfortable yellow confusion again. Temperance hadn't fought harder. She'd talked to the enemy AI, not negotiated exactly. The simulation wasn't programmed for negotiation, but she'd opened a channel and started asking questions. Why are you attacking this facility? What's your strategic objective? If you take this position, what happens next in your operational plan? The AI had responded with standard hostile communications, threats, demands for surrender, tactical posturing, and Temperance had just kept asking questions, genuinely curious, like she was interviewing the AI for a research paper rather than fighting for survival. Right, but if your goal is territorial expansion, wouldn't it be more efficient to bypass fortified positions and establish supply lines first? I mean, you're committing a lot of resources to taking one outpost. That suggests either this position has strategic value I'm not seeing, or you're operating under doctrine that prioritizes symbolic victories over practical gains. The AI had paused, just for 2 seconds. Then it had recalculated its entire attack pattern based on Temperance's observation, realized she was correct about the strategic inefficiency, and stopped attacking. Not retreated. Not surrendered. Just stopped. Because continuing the assault no longer made tactical sense according to its own programming. The simulation had logged it as enemy forces withdrew due to strategic reanalysis. Everyone assumed the AI had been programmed with some hidden victory condition. No one questioned why Temperance's squad, was the only one in 15 cycles to trigger it. Uxalomo's tentacles were doing that anxious dance again. They moved to the next incident, the cultural exchange program. Every cadet participated. It was designed to build cross-species understanding and empathy. You paired up with someone from a radically different background, spent time learning their customs, wrote a reflection paper. Simple, safe, impossible to fail unless you committed some catastrophic diplomatic incident. Temperance had been paired with Oxon, a Kulmati. The Kulmati were rigid, hierarchical, their entire society built on a caste system that had functioned smoothly for 12,000 cycles. Every individual knew their place, accepted their role, found meaning in the structure. They were model citizens, really. Stable, predictable, excellent at specialized tasks. Oxon had been a perfectly typical Kulmati student. Mid-caste, destined for technical operations, content with his designated path. Then he'd spent 2 weeks with Temperance. The incident report was buried in the Cultural Affairs Office archives. Oxlomo had to dig for it, but once they found it, the picture became uncomfortably clear. Multiple Kulmati students had filed complaints, not against Temperance for doing anything offensive, but expressing concern that Oxon was exhibiting inappropriate individualistic tendencies. The interview logs were more revealing. Oxon, sounding confused and slightly distressed. She keeps asking me what I want, not what my caste requires, not what tradition dictates, what I personally want. And I find myself having answers. Answers I did not know I had. Another Kulmati student. He questioned the purpose of the caste system. Out loud, in the dining facility, he asked why we accept our designations instead of choosing our own paths. This is not normal Kulmati behavior. Temperance's reflection paper had been filed under satisfactory, no issues noted. Oxlomo read it now with fresh eyes. I learned that the Kulmati have a fascinating social structure that provides stability and purpose. I also learned that Oxon really likes music, but never pursued it because it's not appropriate for his caste. I wonder if their society might benefit from a little more flexibility. But who am I to judge? It's worked for them for thousands of cycles. Who am I to judge? She'd written, after casually causing an existential crisis that nearly required psychiatric intervention. The pattern was emerging, and Oxlomo didn't like it. They pulled up the philosophy seminar incident. Philosopher General Pakmindo had been a guest lecturer, one of the galaxy's leading thinkers on conflict resolution theory. His presentation of the infinite peace theorem had been elegant, mathematical, irrefutable. Peace, he'd proven, required accepting certain conflicts as permanent features of the galactic landscape, managing them rather than solving them, containing rather than resolving. It was brilliant work. Centuries of research condensed into one beautiful, depressing truth. Some problems don't have solutions, only management strategies. Temperance had raised her hand 15 minutes into the lecture. What if the conflicts themselves evolve? Pakmindo, patient and professional. The theorem accounts for changing circumstances within established conflict parameters. No, I mean, what if the fundamental nature of the conflict changes? Like, what if the thing they're fighting about stops being relevant? Or what if the sides stop being clearly defined? Or what if new factors emerge that make the original dispute meaningless? The mathematical framework is designed to be robust against such variables. But is it, though? Because your model assumes the conflicts are static entities that persist over time. What if conflicts are more like conversations? They change based on who's participating and what else is happening around them. The lecture had devolved from there. Pakmindo had spent 45 minutes trying to explain Why game theory didn't work if you kept changing the rules of the game, while Temperance kept offering increasingly absurd hypotheticals that somehow always seemed to expose edge cases in the theorem. What if both sides forgot what they were fighting about, but kept fighting out of habit? What if the conflict became sentient and decided to resolve itself? What if future peace depended on present conflict, so solving the conflict actually prevented peace? Pakmindo had ended the seminar early, citing unexpected philosophical variables. Oxlomo had heard through the faculty network that he'd been seen in the station's bar afterward, drinking something with far too much alcohol content for a species that metabolized it poorly, muttering about weaponized curiosity. Oxlomo closed the files and sat in the darkness of their office, several tentacles pressed against their head, in what might have been the Kiltharian equivalent of rubbing tired eyes. The pattern was clear now. Temperance didn't break rules. She asked questions that made the rules question themselves. She didn't fight systems. She befriended them and gently suggested they might want to reconsider their life choices. She didn't argue against established frameworks. She just kept poking at the edges until the framework started to look arbitrary. And here was the truly terrifying part. She wasn't doing it maliciously. She wasn't trying to destabilize anything. She was just curious, genuinely, innocently curious about why things had to be the way they were. Humans, Uxlomo realized with creeping horror, didn't accept reality as a fixed state. They treated it like a rough draft. The notification chime interrupted their thoughts. A message from Director Olmuth. Report received. Recommend you archive all interaction logs with the subject. The committee will want complete records. Uxlomo typed a response. Acknowledged. Query. What happened to the last species classified as reality hazard? The reply came quickly. They learned to rewrite causality. We quarantined them before they could export the technology. They haven't been heard from in 289 cycles. Why do you ask? Uxlomo stared at Temperance's file, at her completely ordinary photograph, at her unremarkable performance scores. Because humans don't rewrite causality, they typed slowly. They just ask questions until causality gets confused and rewrites itself. The summons arrived on a Monday morning, or what passed for Monday in station time, since the Institute operated on a standardized cycle that offended approximately 40% of species' circadian rhythms. Temperance was in the commissary, drinking something that claimed to be coffee but tasted like regret mixed with industrial solvent, when her datapad chimed with a priority message. Mandatory appearance. Oversight Committee. Conference Hall, Omega. 1400 hours. Non-negotiable. She stared at it for a moment, then shrugged and took another sip of the terrible coffee. Probably something about graduation assignments. Maybe they wanted to discuss her preference for field placements. She'd requested the cultural liaison track, figured she'd be good at it. This assumption lasted exactly until she walked into Conference Hall Omega and saw who was waiting for her. 5 beings sat in a semicircle that seemed designed to make visitors feel very small and very scrutinized. The lighting was all wrong, too bright on her, too dim on them, creating that dramatic effect that people use when they want you to know you're in trouble but aren't ready to tell you why yet. Temperance stopped just inside the door. "Oh," she said. "This isn't about graduation logistics, is it?" "Please sit, Cadet Temperance." The voice came from the crystalline entity in the center, Director Olmuth, who she'd only ever seen in orientation videos. They looked like someone had convinced a mountain to achieve sentience and then given it anxiety. She sat. The chair was uncomfortable in that specific way, that made you aware someone had probably designed it to be uncomfortable. To Olamuth's left sat something that looked like a small galaxy, compressed into a vaguely humanoid shape. That would be Zok, the hive mind collective. To the right, Lumico Prime, an AI housed in a floating sphere of silver metal. Further down the row, something that hurt to look at directly because it existed in too many temporal states at once, the Memoriam. And at the end, a massive figure in a methane-breathing environmental suit, Kivun, whose species had invented diplomatic immunity after one too many incidents involving accidental atmospheric poisoning. This was not a committee you appeared before for routine matters. "Am I in trouble?" Temperance asked, because someone had to say it. "That," Olamuth said, their voice resonating through the crystal structure of their body, "is precisely what we are attempting to determine." Zok leaned forward, which was unsettling because it meant 50,000 individual organisms moving in perfect synchronization. "Your final assessment raised certain concerns. We would like to understand something about human cognition. Why do you consistently attempt to change the parameters of a problem instead of solving it within the given constraints?" Temperance blinked. "I'm sorry. What?" Lumico Prime's sphere rotated, processing. "Your evaluation on the hostage scenario. You were given two options and attempted to create a third that did not exist within the framework of the question." "Oh." Temperance relaxed slightly. "Is that all? I mean, I was just trying to think through the problem. The question felt incomplete." "Incomplete." Olmuth's crystal structure flickered. "Please, elaborate." "Well, you gave me a scenario with two bad options. Let terrorists win or risk 10,000 lives on a coin flip. But in real life, situations like that have context. There's always more information than the initial setup suggests. So I was trying to find out what the actual problem was, not just react to the surface situation." The Memoriam spoke, their voice echoing from multiple timelines simultaneously. "You rejected the premise of the question." "I guess? I mean, if the premise is flawed, shouldn't someone point that out?" The silence that followed was profound and deeply uncomfortable. Temperance had the distinct feeling she'd said something important without realizing it, which was becoming a distressing pattern in her life. Olamuth gestured with one crystalline limb, and a holographic display materialized. Temperance watched with growing confusion as the screen showed her answer from the exam, then, to her surprise, a cascade of error messages in code she didn't recognize. "This is the assessment system's response to your answer," Lumico Prime explained. "You caused a logic failure in the evaluation programming. The AI could not categorize your response because you engaged with the ethical framework, while simultaneously questioning whether the framework applied." "That seems like a design flaw in the AI," Temperance said, then immediately wished she hadn't, because all 5 committee members did something that might have been the universal equivalent of a wince. Kavun's voice rumbled through his environmental suit, deep and resonant. "This is precisely the behavior pattern that concerns us. You do not see it as unusual. See what is unusual? Asking questions? No." Olamuth's crystal flickered again, this time in what might have been frustration. Treating fundamental parameters as negotiable. And then they showed her everything. The combat simulation where she'd convinced an AI to stop attacking. The cultural exchange where she'd accidentally triggered an existential crisis. The philosophy seminar where she'd argued a mathematical theorem into having doubts about itself. Temperance watched, feeling a bit like she was observing someone else's life. "I mean, those were just conversations. I was trying to understand things." You were restructuring reality, Zoc said, all 50,000 voices speaking in perfect unison. Through inquiry. That's just how learning works. For humans, perhaps. Lumiko Prime's sphere pulsed. For the rest of the galaxy, learning involves understanding existing structures. Humans learn by questioning whether the structures should exist at all. The memoriam shifted, existing in 6 different positions simultaneously. We have observed this pattern across all human integration points. Wherever your species establishes presence, fundamental assumptions begin to destabilize. The Kiltharians have begun developing innovation departments. The Kulmathi are experiencing labor movements for the first time in 8,000 cycles. Even hive minds report individual drift in nodes that interact regularly with humans. That sounds like a good thing? Temperance offered weakly. Does it? Olmeth leaned forward, and their crystal structure caught the light in ways that made Temperance's eyes hurt. The galaxy has maintained peace for 600 cycles through predictability, through systems that all parties understand and accept. Humans undermine that not through violence, not through conquest, but through something far more insidious. What? Hope, Kavun said quietly. You make other species hope that things could be different. Temperance opened her mouth, closed it, tried again. And that's bad because hope is destabilizing. Zoc's 50,000 voices rose slightly, not quite in unison now, some frustrated, some uncertain. Because once beings start questioning whether their circumstances are fixed, they become unpredictable, unmanageable. They start wanting things they never wanted before. They start seeing alternatives where we designed careful inevitabilities. We are not concerned that humans are dangerous, Kivun continued, and his tone was almost gentle. We are concerned that humans are contagious. That landed like a physical blow. Temperance stared at them, these ancient, powerful beings, and realized with creeping horror that they were afraid. Not of human weapons or human aggression, of human curiosity. So, what are you going to do? She asked quietly. Quarantine us? Ban humans from the Institute? We have debated this, Alamuth admitted. At length. Some argue for containment. Others note that humans are already established across 63 sectors. The contagion, if we may call it that, has already spread too far to contain conventionally. Lumiko Prime rotated faster, processing through possibilities. I have proposed an alternative approach. Rather than contain you, we should study how you accomplish this reality negotiation. Develop immunity, perhaps. I don't think you can immunize against asking questions, Temperance said. Exactly, Zoc gestured wildly, or whatever the hive mind equivalent of wildly was. You say that as if it is obvious, as if weaponized curiosity is just a normal feature of existence. It's not weaponized, it's just... The memoriam interrupted, and when they spoke, their voice carried weight from futures that hadn't happened yet. I have observed 6 timelines. In 4 of them, we attempt containment of human influence. In each of those, we fail catastrophically. Our systems cannot suppress a species that treats suppression as a puzzle to solve. They paused, existing in multiple states of distress simultaneously. In one timeline, we embrace human thinking. We transform beyond recognition. Whether that transformation is positive or negative, I cannot determine from this temporal position. And the 6th timeline? Olamuth asked, though their tone suggested they weren't sure they wanted to know. The memoriam turned their attention to Temperance, and she felt the weight of being observed across multiple iterations of reality. In the 6th timeline, this one human, this specific individual, teaches us something we forgot we knew, something we abandoned in favor of stability. What? Temperance whispered. That is unclear. The timeline becomes probabilistic at that junction. Too many variables, too much potential. The committee conferred among themselves in languages and communication methods Temperance couldn't follow. Subsonic rumbles from Kivun, light frequency shifts from Olmuth, Lumico Prime exchanging data packets with Exoku at speeds that made the air shimmer. Finally, Olmuth spoke. We have reached a decision. You will be permitted to continue your training and receive your certification. However, you will be assigned to the perimeter outpost in the quiet zone, a region where, statistically speaking, nothing ever happens. You will be monitored closely. If you demonstrate any reality destabilizing behavior, I'm not destabilizing reality, Temperance protested. I'm just asking questions. Those are the same thing. Zock's 50,000 voices cracked slightly with exasperation. That is the entire problem. You do not distinguish between inquiry and disruption. Cadet Temperance. Oxalomo's voice came from the corner, and she turned to see her instructor standing in the shadows. She hadn't even noticed them there. Do you understand what you do? When you ask these questions? When you suggest that established systems might be negotiable? I'm just trying to understand things. Yes, Uxlomo said softly. That is precisely what terrifies us. 6 months in the quiet zone taught Temperance 2 things. 1, space really was mostly empty, and 2, boredom was a universal constant that transcended species barriers. The perimeter outpost was less a strategic installation and more a bureaucratic formality. A small station monitoring a region of space where, for 500 cycles, absolutely nothing had occurred. No conflicts, no anomalies, no interesting stellar phenomena. Just void, and the 3 unfortunate souls assigned to watch it. Temperance shared the rotation with Oxon, who'd specifically requested the assignment despite his family's protests, and Ulo, a Paloxian whose natural anxiety disorder made him perfectly suited for a job where nothing ever went wrong. He could worry preemptively about theoretical problems, which kept him occupied. Anything on sensors? Ulo asked for the 96th time that shift. Same as the last 95 times you asked, Temperance replied, not unkindly. A whole lot of nothing. I maintain that our vigilance is what keeps it nothing, Ulo muttered, stress molting a few skin cells. Oxon, who'd developed an unfortunate habit of questioning everything since his time with Temperance, looked up from his console. Is it, though? Or is it nothing regardless of whether we watch it? Please do not start, Ulo begged. I have enough hypothetical concerns without adding philosophical ones. It was during one of these shifts, month 6, day 18, hour 9, that something finally happened. Contact, Ulo said, his voice climbing 3 octaves. Unknown vessel, bearing 227, velocity. It's heading toward civilized space. Temperance was at the sensor console before he finished speaking. The vessel was large, configuration unlike anything in the database, and it wasn't responding to standard hails. More concerning, its trajectory suggested hostile intent, or at least extremely poor navigation. Protocol says we alert command and maintain observation distance, Oxon recited, already pulling up the regulations. Protocol says we do not engage under any circumstances, Ulo added frantically, his skin molting in earnest now. Temperance stared at the screen for a long moment. I'm going to talk to them. No. Oxon stood up so fast, his chair toppled backward. No, that is exactly what the committee feared you would say. That is precisely the kind of— They're heading toward populated sectors, Temperance interrupted calmly. If they're hostile, we need to know now. If they're not, we need to know why they're not responding. The answer is to alert command. Ulo was practically vibrating with anxiety. Not to take a shuttle toward an unknown, potentially hostile vessel that could vaporize you? But Temperance was already moving toward the shuttle bay, pulling on her environment suit. Contact command. Tell them what's happening. If I'm not back in 2 hours, assume I made a terrible decision. I am assuming that now, Ulo shouted after her. The shuttle trip toward the unknown vessel took 38 minutes, during which Temperance had plenty of time to wonder if this was, in fact, a terrible decision. The committee's warnings echoed in her head. Don't destabilize anything. Don't question parameters. Don't, and this was apparently the big one, try to change situations through inquiry alone. But if there was one thing humans were categorically bad at, it was leaving well enough alone. She opened a channel when she got within range. Hello? You seem lost. Can we help? Silence. Then, crackling through translation static, why do you not fire? We are invading. Temperance blinked. Are you, though? Because you're not firing either, and invasion typically involves more invasive behavior. Another long pause. This is not standard response protocol. Yeah, I get that a lot. Listen, can we just talk for a minute? You're heading toward civilized space on what looks like an attack vector, but you announced yourself as invading before actually doing any invading, which seems counterproductive. So I'm curious, what's actually going on here? The response took longer this time. Temperance could almost feel the confusion radiating through the void. Finally, we are probe ship from civilization of Ilk. We were uplifted 300 cycles ago by benefactors who then abandoned us. We learned that space is hostile, that all species will attack or abandon. We must strike first. Okay, but, and I'm genuinely asking, what do you actually want? Because invasion seems like a lot of work if you're not even sure what you're invading for. Want? Yeah, like, what's your goal? What would make you happy? Because from where I'm sitting, you folks spent 300 cycles preparing for war. But I'm not hearing anything about what you hope to gain from it. The silence stretched so long that Temperance wondered if the connection had dropped. Then, we want to not be alone. We want knowledge. We want safety. We want to matter. Right. See? Those are good wants. None of those require invasion. In fact, invasion probably makes all of those harder to achieve. But the galaxy is hostile. All species attack or abandon. Some do, sure, but not all. I mean, I'm talking to you right now instead of shooting, which kind of disproves the universal hostility theory. Another long pause. This does not align with our operational doctrine. Maybe your operational doctrine needs updating. What if, and hear me out here, what if you just asked to join the galactic community instead of attacking it? Back at the outpost, Ulo was having what could only be described as a systematic breakdown, frantically transmitting reports to command. Oxon monitored the situation, torn between following protocol and hoping his friend wasn't about to be vaporized. The vessel powered down its weapons. 3 hours later, Temperance was back at the outpost, facilitating a communication between the Ilk probe ship and Institute diplomats. The invasion force turned out to be a single explorer vessel crewed by beings who'd spent centuries alone, convinced that hostility was the only universal language. They were wrong. Turned out, curiosity worked pretty well, too. Temperance filed her incident report. Contact with unknown vessel. They were not hostile, just scared and working from bad assumptions. Talked it through. Situation resolved. Recommend cultural integration protocols. Command's response arrived within hours. Emergency committee review required. The Oversight Committee convened in record time, reviewing every second of the encounter. They analyzed the communication logs, the tactical data, searching for the reality-bending manipulation that must have occurred. They found nothing, just a human asking questions until the situation changed shape. Uxlomo added a final note to Temperance's file. Revision to previous assessment required. Subject is not a reality hazard. Subject is a reality negotiator. She does not bend the universe through force. She simply refuses to accept that the universe has finished negotiating its terms. Recommend classification change to potential paradigm catalyst. Also recommend we stop trying to contain human thinking and start learning from it. They operate on different assumptions about how existence works, and the universe appears to validate their approach with concerning frequency. The committee established a new program, Human Integration Studies, not to contain the contagion, but to understand it, maybe even catch it intentionally. Temperance returned to the Institute 6 months later, not as a student, but as an instructor. Her first lecture was on creative problem-solving. She wrote one question on the board. What if the problem is not what you think it is? In the back, Uxlomo watched their former student with something that might have been pride or terror, or both. The classroom, filled with dozens of species, leaned forward with genuine curiosity. And somewhere in the deep structure of the galaxy, something fundamental shifted. Not broken, not bent, just questioned until it admitted it had other options available. The universe, it turns out, appreciates being asked nicely. And humans, bless their destabilizing, reality-negotiating, question-asking souls, had never learned to stop asking.